Welcome, everybody. Thanks, Candice, for the videos. Yes, so welcome to the conversation, Africa's virtual dialogue, whatever time of day you're experiencing. I hope that you're looking forward to having a really engaging conversation. Today, we are tackling the real cost of peace, why Africa's resources for security deals are a dangerous bargain. My name is Kagure Gacheche, and it's wonderful to have you with us for the fourth dialogue in the Conversation Africa's Virtual Dialogue series this year. Today, we unpack one of Africa's most complex and pressing issues. So this is the growing trend of tying peace to resource access. But before we get going, just a few housekeeping rules, please. Just to let you know, this discussion is part of the Conversation Africa's 2025 Virtual Dialogue series, which is designed to create spaces where researchers, policymakers, and the public get to meet and debate African-led solutions to global challenges. Please note that the event is being recorded and will be available on YouTube. Share your reflections on social media using the hashtags TCA Dialogues and Peace in Africa, please. And lastly, you're welcome to be part of the conversation. Please put your questions in the Q&A for the panelists to answer a little bit later. Now let's get into the discussion. In June this year, the US brokered a peace deal between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda in a bid to resolve 3 decades of conflict. At the heart of the agreement is a controversial strategy, an exchange of access to mineral wealth in return for vague security assurances and economic integration. While this may appear as a path to peace and prosperity, experts have warned that such resources for security arrangements are a modern echo of extractive deals that have historically undermined Africa's sovereignty. So from oil for loans in Angola to battered minerals in the Central African Republic, these deals have entrenched elite capture, they fragmented accountability, and they have deepened dependency. Today, we are joined by a panel of experts who will help unpack this issue for us. Are Africa's resources for security deals a dangerous bargain for the countries involved? So today, I am joined by Professor Henry Mostert, who is SARCHL Chair for Mineral Law in Africa at the University of Cape Town. Her research focuses on mineral and energy law, expropriation, and legal frameworks for the just energy transition across Africa. She works at the intersection of law, policy, and governance, applying systems thinking to complex challenges in the extractive sector. We are also joined by Professor Tracy Linfield, who is a professor of environmental and sustainability law at the University of the Witwatersrand. She is a distinguished legal scholar, an educator, and an advocate whose career has been dedicated to advancing climate justice, water governance, environmental governance, and human rights in Africa and beyond. We also have with us Nicole Batumike, who is a gender and responsible sourcing specialist at the Congolese nonprofit Panzi Foundation. She's currently pursuing a second master's degree in mineral law in Africa at the University of Cape Town. So you're very, very welcome to the conversation. And I'm sorry, I see that we have one more panelist who's joined. Let me just introduce him quickly. Dr. Oluwole Ajewale is a research fellow. He has a PhD in urban and regional planning. He possesses senior level experience in supporting policy that influences projects through advocacy, advisory, evidence gathering, and dissemination work across 24 countries in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. So you're all very, very welcome to today's conversation. And I think if I can just ask you all to please turn on your cameras so that we can get into the conversation, that would be great. But whenever you're ready. Nicole, maybe let's start with you just so that we can set the scene and kind of figure out what this conversation is going to be about. Nicole has been developing Panzi's ethical jewelry brand through the establishment of traceable and inclusive mine-to-market models with local and international partners. Nicole, please help us understand in the DRC how the situation plays out on the ground and what does this mean in terms of the topic we are navigating today.
Thank you so much, Kagure. So I am very happy to be here today. It's quite early for me because I'm currently in Washington, D.C. So I'm sorry, but I will not turn on my camera today. I hope this is okay. So I currently, as you've described, we worked on the development of an ethical jewelry brand in Eastern Congo, which has been developed through the Panzi Foundation, which is a foundation and a hospital that works with survivors of sexual violence. I'm sure as many of us here are aware, the use of rape as a weapon of war is quite prevalent in Eastern Congo and is very much linked to the mineral extraction. So we've been working with mining communities for a few years now. Today, I am actually based in Washington, D.C., and I do work with different stakeholders on the value chain. So that is stakeholders based in Silicon Valley or in other places in the country, in Washington, D.C. So we work with policymakers. And I would say that in terms of the current situation, we've seen escalation in Eastern Congo with the conflict starting actually 2021, which was marking the resurgence of M23, which is a Rwandan-backed armed group that has been taking over different parts of the East for the past few months, and in a way that is quite escalated. So they took over Goma in January and took over Bukavu in February, which are two of our capital province of the capitals, of our two Kivusian provinces in the east. That is what sparked the discussion between our president and President Trump for the mineral partnership, rather the mineral for security partnership, which I am very happy that we will be discussing today. In terms of where we are today and what the community or our communities can see when it comes to those mineral partnerships, unfortunately, and I'll also speak as someone from the civil society that is seeking to bring some level of inclusion in those discussions, maybe from the people who are the most affected. So that is women, children, people from those mining communities, survivors of sexual violence, but also simply, again, members of the civil society, of the Congolese civil society, to be included in those discussions. It's been very challenging for a number of reasons. To get a level of transparency on those deals, but also see to which extent they would come to life. Right now, we do have a few deals that are happening in Katanga, which is not the region that is actually affected by the war. And there are discussions around some of the mines in the affected region. So for the mine of Rubaya, for example, which is a coltan mine that we have in the eastern part that's currently occupied by M23. And there are reports as well from the UN. So the latest UN group of experts reports actually explain or state that M23 has been making close to $1 million US dollars per month simply with the mine of Rubaya. So this mine is in the discussion, but again, we lack transparency on what the proceeds or processes are going to be, because currently it is being occupied. The concession is owned, so we have concession owners, but we do have American investors looking into that specific mine. What we wonder is, how are we going to be able to make this mine a part of this deal when the withdrawal of M23 and Rwandan troops in Eastern Congo is not being prioritized? So I would stop there. Again, I'm very happy if you would have questions that can make this very nuanced situation a bit clearer. But I would stop at very much, again, if those mineral partnerships for now are not tangible to us because there is no prioritization of the withdrawal of the troops and the restatement of our territorial integrity in Eastern Congo.
Yeah, it's certainly a really complex situation as we had described earlier. But I'm wondering, because you are basically developing an ethical jewelry brand, what does it look like when you say that you are establishing a traceable mine to market model? In, say, in an ideal world, what would that look like? How would it end on my neck? Mm-hmm.
I love that you did say in an ideal world, because we've been trying to do that for since 2019 now. So that was the first project that I was assigned to. We actually conceptualized it starting in 2018, and then sought to work with different mining cooperatives in Eastern Congo for the formal trade of colored gemstones and gold in the region, so that we could then transform those minerals and transform that into Congolese-made jewelry. The idea was to introduce transformation, local transformation, to the extent that we could arrive to final products and show through that transformation that actually this is something that is possible in our region, but also for women, especially for survivors, obviously to transform those minerals and do crafts, do designing when you are going through a healing process is very very empowering, in the sense that it's also about the ownership of our own resources. It's about transforming something that is rough or raw into something that can become beautiful again or in a different way. So it was also simply the symbolic behind this. The other reason why we started this project is because in the past, actually before the Belgians, we were doing jewelry. We had craftsmen that were working copper in that region. So we wanted to go back to that. What we actually were wearing at the time is our called the nyerere. So we had that around our ankles, around our wrists, and there was a symbolic to it. It was traditional ancestral jewelry, and we wanted to make an ode to that as well, and show, again, this is something that we are able to do. Those are our resources, and we want to go back into discussing that ownership. Now, when it comes to the formality of it and the legality of it, it got a bit complex. And this is also why I kind of transformed my role into what it is today, which is more policy work and seeking to influence both our policies and laws at a national level and at an international level, because unfortunately it was impossible for us to do what we sought to do. It's impossible to buy formal gold or gold in the artisanal markets in a way that is formal in Eastern Congo because of a level of different reasons. But I would say that the main one is the fiscal framework, which unfortunately makes it so that it's not beneficial for the cooperatives that we work with, despite all of the training that we can give them in terms of responsible sourcing, due diligence, traceability trainings. We can do all of this. We can provide them with boots, with helmets to make their work less risky, but the systemic issues will still be there. And that systemic issue is that there are incentives for them to smuggle rather than to sell their gold on the formal markets at a rate that makes it now not even they are unable to actually break even if they do sell on the local markets.
That makes sense. Thank you for setting the scene for us. let me move now to Professor Henry so that we can broaden the conversation a little bit more. And Professor Henry, in your opinion, or in your view and your expertise, what legal frameworks currently govern mineral for security arrangements, and where do you see the biggest gaps?
Thank you, Kagure. Africa has many mining codes. I think almost every African country has a mining code or laws governing the extraction of mineral resources. But what we don't have, where there are gaps, is in understanding how resources link to peace agreements. So the typical expectation or understanding is for a mining company to apply for a mining license or an authorization or whatever it is called in the various jurisdictions of Africa, and to meet certain obligations, certain requirements to be able to be granted these licenses. But these resources for peace deals bring another layer, and that is, in exchange for this license, we're going to give you something else. So what we don't know, because these deals live very much in the shadows, is what is the actual barter? Is it that the requirements are being relaxed, the typical requirements for licensing, or are specific providers being prioritized because they come from an area which is now given to, or after providing peace in an area. So what is the real exchange? And I think that is the gap in understanding the framework. So because we don't have a template, I almost want to say we don't have a continental template for linking resources with peace agreements. Every state improvises. And improvisation is the enemy of accountability. So I think what we need, the gap that we need to fill is that these peace agreement, resource bartered peace agreement deals need to go through the same scrutiny, parliamentary scrutiny, as any concession, as any license, because we cannot build peace on secrecy. And that is what a hidden contract really is. It's a secret.
Thank you. I was just writing notes because that's true. And that we worked on the issue of parliamentary scrutiny and the lack of that process was such a sticking point, DRC Rwanda deal. Maybe just to bring in Professor Tracy Lynn, in your view, how do extractive linked peace deals impact environmental sustainability and community rights?
Thank you, Kagure. So I'm going to answer with a preface, and then I'm going to answer in two parts. So my preface is that when I speak about the peace deal in this particular forum, I don't want to talk about I want to kind of keep in play that we have peace, P-E-A-C-E, and we have peace, P-I-E-C-E. And I want to keep those two in play. So the definition of peace, P-I-E-C-E, is a portion of an object or of a material produced by cutting, tearing, or breaking the whole. And our fear is that the peace deal is going to be a peace deal, which further contributes to the historical dismemberment of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is paradoxically one of the richest countries in the world, biodiversity, energy, water, people, and one of the poorest. 19% of the population have access to electricity, and far fewer have access to potable water. So how is that possible? And the reason it's possible is because since the 1400s, when the kings of Congo interacted with the Europeans, there's been a traumatic extraction from the territory of the DRC. First on the slave trade, then rubber, and now mining, coltan. So I for myself, I'm not necessarily talking about a PEACE deal. So to answer your question, how do these extractive deals impact on environmental justice? I think it's first important to understand how conflict impacts the environment. And so we know that since the late 1990s, there's been a terrible conflict, the African War, really, the First and Second Congo War, and many people displaced. And so that has environmental consequences when people are displaced and when they don't have access to electricity and they don't have access to water. So I'm going to place in the chat some resources for people to look at. And these are resources around, and I will do so when I'm finished speaking so that I don't get distracted. They're really resources about looking at the environmental impacts of the resurgence in the conflict. And Nicole created a good context to that, speaking about M23 since 2021, taking over new towns in the provinces of Kivu. There's been some very good monitoring of the deforestation in that area. So that is one of the major environmental impacts that has occurred. And it's occurred because of the humanitarian disaster. In the Eastern Congo, you've had displacement of many of 800,000 people, for example. 800,000 people joined the city of Goma post 2021, and all of those people need energy, and they will get that energy by crossing the water into the Virunga National Park, which is the World Heritage Site, home to the mountain gorillas, and they will chop down the wood. So there is a massive, with this conflict and the displacement of people, there is deforestation, and they've measured that. The forest deforestation monitors have measured that, and there is then contributes to further problems like landslides. There is an extensive illegal charcoal and timber trade, which actually is more valuable than the trade in illegal minerals. So according to the sources I've looked at, something like $45 million a year. And that is linked to the control that these armed groups have, which have shifted between the Democratic government, the DRC government, and the M23 and at the armed groups. And the way that they extract value is that they will have roadblocks where they impose a toll on people wanting to transport this charcoal and this wood. So the energy issue, the energy injustice, is linked with environmental injustice, is linked with climate injustice, is linked with conflict. So that really is the first part of my question. So then the second part, and I'll end with that, is how do these peace deals link up with environmental justice? So the agreement that the United States brokered, which is an agreement between Rwanda and DRC, but with the US kind of in the background, and Qatar, parts of the joint security mechanism, mentions the humanitarian crisis. So the key link is resolving the humanitarian crisis. And I do want to say something more about that a bit later, about how do you resolve a humanitarian crisis? How is it linked with rape as a tool of war? But we have to address the humanitarian crisis if we're going to address environmental injustice.
Thank you for that really considered response and just such a clarity of view. Just to bring in Dr. Jawale into the conversation, it's been mentioned by the previous panelists, but in your view, as a security and political economy of conflict scholar, how do you view civil society and local institutions? How can they be strengthened to monitor these kinds of arrangements?
Thank you so much, Kaguri. Are you referring to the arrangement on the implementation of mineral for security guarantee? Or okay.
Yes,
Well,
yes, just that, yes.
I think that is a bit straightforward because largely the conversation has completely excluded the civil society organizations. And to the extent to which, for me, it appears like, one, what the United States of America has done is to broker peace at their own instance, at their own dictate, without paying due attention to the other building blocks that are supposed to serve as the infrastructure of peace that whole structure should stand upon. And what do I mean by that? I think at the risk of sounding funny, maybe because of the pressure for the Nobel Peace Prize, there was a concerted effort to produce peace, like fast food in Africa. And if you listen to that conversation in Washington that day, they were asking Bulus, and he said, the next is Sudan. So it appears like boxes are meant to be ticked. And that is the reason why we are where we are now, because having signed those agreements, and Tshisekedi was firmly interested in saying things that would be suiting to Donald Trump, which, when you look at what has been happening in Ukraine and what Zelensky was battling with, America was definitely interested in the resource in Ukraine to negotiate for security guarantee. I think that is what Tshisekedi also latched onto, and that made for this what I consider as one-sided extractive diplomacy, in the sense that it appears that America was interested, and like Professor Tracy has mentioned, this is about the most wealthiest country in Africa, at least as we know. There is a report from, I think, World Bank, which I also cited in my paper in Cortan in DRC in 2021, that says the mineral deposit in DRC is valued at about 24 trillion US dollar. It then means that all countries should be interested in DRC, particularly with respect to the ongoing conversation on energy transition that position DRC at the center of global interest in energy diplomacy, material sourcing, mineral sourcing for lithium, for cobalt, for coltan, these strategic minerals. So I don't see the input of the civil society organization in that agreement to start with. And if there's going to be any agreement whatsoever that is going to be useful, particularly for the people of DRC, this is the advocacy that we've made over time, that you can't shave a man's head in his absence. And it is those people that need to be present in developing and mainstreaming such agreement. But if you look at how events have turned, I think we have even moved away from the Washington discourse or agreements. We've moved to Qatar. And it goes to show that the event in DRC looks like one step forward and two steps backward, which has become like a circus. But for the broadly African conversation, because this is not peculiar to the DRC alone, we've seen this in the Sahel, we've seen this even in Sudan, in which it's not only about America alone. Places where Wagner Group are also operating in Africa, report shows that in most cases they were compensated. They are being compensated with mineral resources. whether it is in Sudan, whether it is in Central African Republic, whether it is in Mali. There are copious evidence that suggests that compensation has been in form of mineral resources, and that is for security service or security guarantee support to the military in those places. It leads me in one direction, and it's the fact that the third wave of the scrambling for Africa is playing out before our eyes, and it appears like the African leaders are probably ignorant or are not paying attention. Because if you look at what is going on now, there is a strategic interest in African minerals, like we've seen in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that is being renewed now through geopolitics, in which the larger conversation should be how African countries are going to actually own these minerals, process these minerals, and bargain from the long hand of the stick. But, if you look at rhetorics by Tshisekedi, it was almost like begging America, because he wanted to say what Trump was going to listen to, that we're going to offer DLC minerals for security guarantee. That is the decisions that have led Africa to where we are now, whether from the gold mine of South Africa or to the oil in Angola or to the oil in Nigeria, in which we were just producing these raw materials and there's no strategic interest in holding those materials and processing them. And now enters the conversation around security guarantees. I think it leaves African countries with the short end of the stick, and it's not going to go anywhere. And it's poor diplomacy of the highest order, if I could put it that way, which needs to be reversed, and then find a means to negotiate peace, and not just like it used to be in the days of slave trade, in which people will offer their children so that they can probably be saved or left alone. I think what we did with what the previous leaders did with minerals, with children who were turned to slave, is what the present leaders are trying to do with strategic minerals in Africa. But I've said that, and I need to go back to the question that you raised. Civil society input is near zero in the present negotiation on mineral for peace in DRC and perhaps other parts of Africa, whether it is Mozambique or Angola or anywhere. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you for that. And I agree. Sometimes it is tempting to imagine that you are happy to accept peace at any cost. But like Professor Henry said, you can't build peace in secrecy. And this leads us perfectly, and your views lead us perfectly into the next session on, so what do we do next? How do we rethink peace financing and African agency? What can we do differently so that African states are not trading away their sovereignty just to finance peace? So Professor Henry, maybe just coming back to you, what do you think African governments can do to avoid contractual asymmetries with powerful foreign actors? And like has been mentioned, it's not just the US, it's lots of other countries. Sorry, Prof, you're on mute.
5 years after COVID and we're still not getting it right. I think that question of yours, it plugs into another deeper question about how we understand sovereignty. And Africa has had a very checkered history with sovereignty, but just, a very simplistic kind of understanding would be true sovereignty would mean we get to decide when and how and why we extract. We are not being forced to extract because it's a collateral for peace. So, and just to keep in mind also that every ton that we barter now is a ton of minerals that we lose for rebuilding or building or growing African institutions and African capacity. So when you ask me the question about how to avoid contractual asymmetry because there seems to be a power imbalance. My short answer would be knowledge. Knowledge is what equals out the imbalance. Knowledge needs to be the security guarantee. Because that is the counterweight to asymmetry. It's growing capacity, and that is legal capacity, it's technical capacity, it's institutional capacity. I've just come out of 2 weeks of teaching a marvelous group of Africans, students, law students, and others around resource negotiation. And I walked away with something they taught me, which is if there's anything that needs to go into these contracts, it is including technical and skills transfer. So I'm inclined to say that the only thing that we can actually barter our resources for in Africa is in exchange for knowledge, technical skills, and the transfer. And these contracts need to these contracts need to have mandated community restoration initiatives. It has to enforce local employment and shared infrastructure after conflict. So there are ways in which you can negotiate that in if you are negotiating for an African country. It's not just about the revenues. We can use the minerals that we have. You know, we often think that that asymmetry leaves us powerless. There is a lot of leverage in being the host country of minerals that are sorely desired by the rest of the world. And in fact, I think that the countries that hold these minerals, that host these minerals, are the ones that hold the future. That's a lot of power right there. And understanding that, going into a negotiation, understanding that we are not desperate, I think is the beginning of equaling out that asymmetry.
Oh, that's powerful. That's really powerful that asymmetry doesn't leave us hopeless. And maybe just to bring you back into the conversation, Nicole, what would it look like for you? How would this kind of reality and skills transfer and knowledge empowerment look like for you? Because you deal with groups that are on the ground. For you, what would be the priorities in terms of this skills transfer?
I am thinking a lot, sorry, because I obviously, as Prof. Henry mentioned, it is essential to have contracts that have this included at the minimum. And I would say that in terms of skills transfer, we have to focus on transformation and local value addition. I would say that in the situation of the DRC, it has to be about also the diversification of the economy. And so we also have to think about how to transfer skills to the community in a way that is going to ensure a sustainable economy. Also because resources are finite. Not sure if my accent is right with this word, but it's not there forever. And we have to think about those different elements. I think that an important element that was also mentioned by Dr. Ojewale is, I think through his intervention, what we can understand is that those processes just in what they are and what they represent, the peace agreement, which is what is used as the base for those discussions around the mineral partnerships, this is flawed. The peace agreement itself is flawed. And I think that what we also need to understand are those historical ties that we have with the US, the historical ties that we have with Rwanda, and what has been happening in the Great Lakes region for 3 decades, but also what has been happening to Congo for a very long time. I think that the way in which our history of conflict, our history of loss, also mentioning Patrice Lumumba, whose death was actually clearly linked to mineral extraction as well, and to the US, and to the threat that he represented for Western powers that sought to access minerals in that region, but also who did not want the Soviet Union to access the specific minerals in the region. I think just understanding the history of the DRC, and again, how resources have been more a curse than anything else, is very important for us to be able to really address those systemic issues, and to come back to the peace deal and those mineral partnerships. As Dr. Ojewale was saying, again, the lack of political inclusivity in the peace agreement, the lack of inclusion from the civil society, in that peace agreement, we are mainly discussing an issue between Rwanda and Congo, and we barely mention M23. M23 now is occupying an area that has more than 5 million people in it. We have a parallel state that's being installed. So they have shuffled the administration. We now have police. We have an army that is M23/AFC. They've installed themselves, and we speak new languages in the administration. We have new passports now. They are starting to issue passports. So they are really implementing a parallel state. And this parallel state has a direct link with the government in Kigali. There are a number of reports that explain that tie, that link. We also have Rwandan Defense Forces troops on Congolese soil. Since we can't really establish since when, but from the beginning of this year, we've had clear reports, and Prof. Field also shared a resource from Reuters, and we have Sonia Relay, who's the author of that piece. Anything that Sonia Relay will cover on the situation in Eastern Congo, actually, she's a great resource to better understand who, what, and how this occupation is happening in Eastern Congo. I'm also going to share a few other resources to better establish that link between, again, the US and how much support the US has been providing to Rwanda and Uganda in the past 3 decades when it comes to their military development, their aid. The US was the largest donor of Rwandan aid for a very long time. They've been supporting the development of their transformation industry. So again, there are a number of things to understand. How has the US been involved in those different proxy wars, in the coup, the coup of Mobutu in the 90s, again, in the killing of Lumumba in the 60s. I think just understanding those historical ties make it, unfortunately, a bit more complicated than simply including those provisions, in the mining contracts, which obviously that is the minimum. But if it's done in a framework or under those circumstances where we don't have our sovereignty at large, where there is a number of other intervention, if there is funding of military, again, that is happening, funding of aid and aid money that actually goes or ends up in the hands, of the military, it is not going to work. And again, I really want to insist on the fact that the precondition for all of this should be the withdrawal of M23 and Rwandese forces from the Congolese soil. Right now, we don't have territorial sovereignty. Right now, me as a person from Eastern Congo cannot go home because it is not Congo right now. This is not Congo. It's an independent state. It's a parallel state that is there. And that means so many other things, right? To us and to our families who are there, our colleagues who are there. It's been a very difficult time, and I think for people to really also get that. It's very hard to get that those realities and how tangible that is. But again, I can send another source as well that also gives more detail on what it means to be under occupation right now.
Thanks for sharing that, Nicole. I think we all feel your pain, and it's dreadful. It's dreadful to just imagine the kind of human toll that the DRC war has had on citizens for 3 decades, and it continues to just get worse and worse and worse. So sorry for just going through that. Maybe just to bring in Professor Tracy Lynn, you had mentioned earlier that you would like to address just the humanitarian toll and what it means in terms of environmental justice and post-conflict reconstruction. Would you like to speak to that, please?
Thank you, Kigore. Yes, so
Yep.
On the one hand, the peace agreement that was signed in June speaks about the humanitarian crisis. It's Article 4. It states refugees, it deals with refugees, internally displaced persons, and humanitarian considerations. And it binds the contracting parties to create enabling conditions for the delivery of humanitarian assistance in compliance with international humanitarian law. So that's in the agreement. But at the same time, as this agreement that was brokered between the two parties was concluded, at the beginning of the year, the Trump administration dismantled US aid. And USAID included funding for the survivors of rape victims in the Eastern DRC. So I'm going to post another resource in the chat which talks about how a contract for rape kits, which was something like 67,000 rape kits, which included things like prevention against HIV infection and unwanted pregnancies, was cancelled. So how do you square this? Having an agreement that says humanitarian assistance will be provided, and at the same time cutting funding for an instrument of war. So I think we need some kind of radical realism and I completely agree, knowledge is power. That we know we can't have this double standard. Either we are invested in resolving the humanitarian crisis or we aren't. And if we aren't, let's just be clear that the real purpose of the deal is to enable essentially the conflict between the United States and China. I mean, that's actually the conflict that we're dealing with here now. And it's a conflict over dominance, which didn't begin with the Trump administration. One can ask why was President Biden in Angola in December 2024? And he was there to promote the Lobito Corridor, which is it's trying to rival China's Belt and Road Initiative. So understanding all this is important. I have to hope that it is in the interests of China and the United States that the people of Africa can develop so that they can buy their products. Otherwise, where are your consumers of the future going to be? So surely, can we not work with both of these superpowers to resolve the humanitarian crisis in the Eastern DRC and enable Africans to rise to their true potential and to conserve and to have forge their own development paths. So that's what I could say further about the humanitarian crisis, and that the environment itself could be a source for peace building. There is some literature. There's a paper from 2019 which sets out a conceptual framework for thinking about the environment as a basis, the environment itself as a basis for cooperation and peace building. And it's interesting in that Manga Bay source that I shared, there's talk there of M23 wanting to be seen as a good governor and wanting to kind of do good on conservation. And national parks is also it's mentioned in the peace accord of June. So you have a whole host of interesting dynamics. But that peace building, to be sustainable, needs to take place at various levels. It needs to have technical cooperation. It needs to be restorative at a low politics level, at the level of communities. And then over time, it needs to be institutionalized. One can only hope.
Great. One can hope. We live in hope. Thanks for that. Maybe just a final question from me before we take questions from the audience. For Dr. Ojawale, Professor Henry mentioned in the beginning that while mining codes do exist in different countries, there are several blind spots, and in some instances, you tend to find kind of like a knee-jerk reaction when certain situations arise, and that we don't really have a continental standard for these kinds of agreements. In your view, are there continental bodies that should exist or do exist and can help African countries navigate these kinds of asymmetrical agreements?
Thank you so much. I think currently, as we're having this meeting, and I do hope I'm properly updated, there is a mining conference going on in China now, which is modeled after the China-African relation kind of meetings that we've been having. I got a wave of that yesterday, and it's a fallout of, I think, a recent meeting that I also had, I think, in Dubai, where African countries are trying to solidify a collective framework to address mining issues from environmental, economic, and political dimension. I will try to look for the link and probably post it in the course of this meeting. Now, I think this is flowing from the fact that two things. One, oil-producing countries like Nigeria, Angola, and a few other countries are probably looking at their counterpart in the Gulf region, what Qatar, what UAE, and Saudi Arabia have been able to do with oil money. And they have squandered it here on our continent. And why the world is moving in the direction of alternative energy, clean energy, I think African countries are realizing that they've probably missed out of that wave. And in the recent time, the conversation is about strategic minerals that are going to power the next economy that we're probably moving into. What will be the role of cobalt, coltan, lithium, as some of these resources. So I see a bit of a galvanization of African countries, particularly those producing gold, the South Africa, the Zimbabwe, Ghana, Mali, Sudan, I mean, the big producers. So I think there's a bit of a policy movement in that direction in terms of coordinating continentally in terms of mineral extraction. But within this is also the intertwined factor of elite interest in all these things. So if we talk about mining code for who? For artisanal miners in DRC, in Bukavu, in Goma. I mean, those are even cities. I'm talking about remote places where mineral is being mined, in Rubaya and all these places where the state is minimally present or cannot even venture at all. So you have some organizations who are seated in Brussels, in London, and all these places who claim to be doing certification, but they can't venture into those places. Conflict in the northwestern part of Nigeria is almost outpacing Boko Haram now, even though let's talk about at the heart of that conflict now is the rule of God, in which is now what is actually propelling and sustaining the armed groups in those places. Yes, there could be mining code in Abuja, there could be policy statements in those places, but when state presence is minimal, then operationalizing those policies at the local level becomes very difficult or non-existent or impossible. And at the same time, everyday minerals are coming out of those places, whether it is in South Africa, the Zama, or whether it is in Sudan, where gold is now at the heart of the conflict of the civil war. I think you can only operationalize policy where there is stability, political stability. And everywhere mineral is being mined on the continent now, there is one conflict or the other, which has also indicted the elite in those places. So we talk about galvanizing efforts, and the Minister for Mines are traveling and crisscrossing countries to project. I think Nigeria is probably is presently chairing that mining group in Africa now. I came across that news in the recent time. But what I think is missing is that there is a lot happening at the top in terms of top down, but very little is happening in those local communities because the state cannot fully exert the monopoly of violence or control in those places. I think that is what limits the operationalizing of those mining codes. And to now talk about how we can galvanize that to serve a continental purpose. And, you know, I will anchor on the note that whether it is environmental conservation or mineral extraction, it has to be treated as national security. And that means there is a need for genuine commitment and policy trust on the part of government to actually establish statehood where minerals are present. I remember when I was doing field work in Bukavu and Goma, South and North Kivu in 2021. I was privileged to meet a very top senior official, and we're talking about coltan. And he told me that there are places that there's vast mineral deposits, but they themselves cannot access those places. Those who exert governance over those places are the armed groups. So until the state is fully present, and the state presence is felt by the local communities, the issues of extractive conflict and lack of accountability in the extractive sector, I think it will remain a long-term conversation that we're going to continue to have. But this is the reality of people that are living in those places. And I'm not sure things have improved significantly since the last time I visited Eastern DRC in 2021. Whether it is in Mali or it is in Burkina Faso, this is also the same crisis all over the places. The world is interested in what we have in Africa, but I'm not sure our leaders are paying sufficient attention to those strategic minerals that are going to be redefining the economy of the future, which we have in abundance in Africa. Let me hang on that note.
Thank you for that. And I think it also speaks to what Nicole mentioned. Not much has changed despite all disagreements. And perhaps this also speaks to the frustration that I sense in this question from the audience, where someone asks, why are we focusing on what should have happened? Isn't there an opportunity to build benefits across the DRC and address the systemic problems in a more peaceful environment? So rather than fault finding in the latest developments or waiting to see what more, if anything, that the US government might want to demand. And she explains that by this, she means that peace is achieved little by little by civil societies rather than handed over on a plate. Maybe Prof. Henry, this is something that you would like to address, because you did touch on this a little bit in the beginning. Why are we focusing more on the faults in the peace agreement rather than being happy enough that we have peace? Muted again, sorry.
My counter question would be, how do we know that we have peace? What must happen for us to know that we are in a place where we can be happy that there's peace? From the conversation here around this virtual table, I didn't get the impression that there's peace. And I think that is probably where the concern comes from, is the veneer of peace, the semblance of peace that is being created at a very high level, without even actually putting boots on the ground, which would just be a crisis management thing anyway. But I agree with the question, the asker of the question, in as far as peace happens little by little, and peace happens together with healing. And I would really invite us also to think about what must be healed on this continent. Nicole has mentioned atrocities that are happening and that are still happening. Professor Tracy has mentioned environmental atrocities. And my thinking here is that we are on a continent, we are in a continent that has experienced various forms of trauma over and over and over again for many, many years, centuries even. And the healing that is needed to get to peace, being at peace with ourselves and at peace with the rest of the world and everyone that has contributed to those traumatic events, it's a slow process. And my sense is also that while the trauma stays unmetabolized, it affects everything, including the way in which we negotiate our resource contracts, the deals that we make, the viewing only the short-term gains rather than looking at the long-term priorities, and the tolerating of infringements on sovereignty, resource sovereignty, and country sovereignty. So I think if there's one thing that I would like to have reframed, if I could have my way, is that that we stop thinking about resources for peace or resources for security as a solution. To me, this is just new grammar to explain and to entrench a dependency that has existed since forever. And if one could change that, reframe that into thinking that the resources are there for our resilience, resources for resilience, it might change the way in which we negotiate.
And that's such a fantastic end it. Sorry. That's a really good way to think about it. I agree with you on the reframing. And just because I've taken a look at the time, maybe we could do a quick wrap up of our conversation. Thank you so much for everything that you have said, everything that you have shared. Nicole, would you like to go first and just give us your closing remarks, please?
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for taking the time to discuss Congo today. I also saw a last question, sorry, in the chat by Stanley Nyawera. And just to respond, yes, the United Nations is supposed to be a part of the deal. It's Section 5 of the peace agreement. They are supposed to be supporting the secularization of the population. But I would say again, I think the priority right now is for Rwanda to withdraw from Eastern Congo, to withdraw their support to M23 as well. And unfortunately, the fact that this is where we are makes it so that at a minimum, that is where we are. This is the urgency. So discussing anything else at this moment sometimes feels, and I'll talk for myself, and I put the link of Panzi Foundation in the chat, but Panzi was founded by Dr. Denis Mukwege, who is a gynecologist and human rights activist, also a Nobel Peace Prize from 2018 from the DRC. I think what has been difficult in the advocacy work that we had to do in the past few months is to discuss minerals for peace, to be honest, and to even have to engage in those discussions and to seek to have people understand, this could be sustainable. You could do this in a way that is respectful of our lives, and have to show different stakeholders that there is a way to do this in a way that is respectful. Feels very, we sometimes feel like beggars, especially as there are people currently dying, currently going through the violence that we've all mentioned here, displacement, rape, etc. So it feels very belittling, to be honest, to be in those conversations sometimes where we have to discuss those frameworks while, again, there is occupation right now. Our land is at risk. The territorial sovereignty of the country is at risk. And I don't think that, again, the public understand the emergency, the urgency that there is in Congo's the protection of our territorial sovereignty at the moment.
Thank you for that, Nicole, and thank you for participating either way and just engaging so honestly with the question. Thanks so much. Professor Tracy Lin, would you like to give your closing remarks, please?
I'm going to be brief. I really just want to underscore the need to have a long perspective, to understand the history of the Congo, to understand the history of the United States' involvement with the Congo, and to be fully aware of all the linkages between the conflict, how it links to the environment, just to be aware of the linkages. Prof. Henry will enjoy this, but M23 is part of the system. They are part of the system. So it's impossible to realize a peaceful resolution without their involvement. Even if you don't like them, to be part of the system, and I make no judgment about. It's just a sort of fact for me that they have to be included. Otherwise, peace will be elusive.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Ojewale.
Thank you so much. There really isn't so much to add. I think this is a very exciting and highly illuminating experience. I'm excited that we are putting this on the front burner, and it's for the fact that we have missed the previous transformational experiences that other advanced countries were able to put their natural endowment to use and transform their societies. And then a new epoch is upon us now as African countries. And it's a conversation that we need to continue to maintain and remind ourselves that we can't afford to miss the opportunity that is upon us now. We must evolve useful strategies that can help us to transform our mineral endowments, to improve the quality of lives of our people, and to actually advance our collective development from the local communities to our cities and towns. I think this is what I found very, very useful now. I wasn't born in the previous ages that I mentioned, but I've read history. And if we have squandered all the money that came from oil, if we couldn't make much of the agrarian revolution, the technological revolution, now that the big powers are now turning over to Africa, Qatar isn't interested in the conflict in Sudan just for treason. There's something there for UAE, for Saudi Arabia. And the same thing for Congo, that has been at the center of this for over 50 years. So when African leaders gathered at the AU or in their regional economic communities, we owed it as a duty, as academia, as scholars, as advocates in the civil society, to continue to drive this until we begin to see marginal or incremental changes. Because I think, like I mentioned earlier, Africa has what the world needs, and we must take advantage of that by negotiating from the position of strength and not of weakness, like a beggarly society that is at the mercy of those who need our resources. So thank you for putting this together, and it has been a learning curve for me personally.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Professor Henry, to close us up.
Thank you. I'm still thinking about the previous question, and I just also want to add that peace that is transactional is useless. And then maybe the parting idea would be resources, our resources, that's our leverage, that's the power, and that is what will control the future, determine the future. And if Africa trades its minerals, its power, for external military protection, we're going to stay stuck in cycles of dependency. If we trade them for knowledge, for skills, for building communities and infrastructure that we own and that we can maintain, that's when we resource ourselves for the future.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, panelists. This has been such an engaging conversation. I've really, really, really enjoyed getting your insights on this conversation and just thinking about, taking the long view, reframing the conversation as resources for our resilience, and just, I feel hope-filled. And thank you so much. I think it was a fantastic discussion. Thank you to everyone else who's joined us today. And before we close off, I'm going to hand over to our West Africa regional editor for some final words and the wrapping up. Thank you.
Thank you, Kagure. And thank you for such an excellent moderation of these conversations that we've had here so far. And, truly illuminating, truly enriching. I've had several takeaways, and now I am struggling to pick the most interesting one that I would want to talk about. But I think Professor Henry made a statement that I have actually written down. I feel like I might have to frame it. She said, peace that is transactional is useless. I think for me, it sums it all up. I think that's a very, very profound statement that I think we should all go home and think about. And I hope that we're able to actually escalate that to that point where everyone else who needs to hear it and hasn't heard it or hasn't been part of this conversation should hear it. For me, that sums it all up. Thank you very much. Meanwhile, my rule is right now is just very, very, very simple. It's just to say thank you. I think I have said that a couple of times already, but I really must say a huge thank you to everyone who's been part of this conversation today. Thank you, Kagure, for that excellent moderation. And thank you to our panelists, our Professor Henry Mosted, Professor Tracy Linfield, Dr. Oluwole Ojewale, and Nico Batumike. I thank you very, very much for joining us today and for lending us your expertise, insight, your knowledge of the issue in discourse, and being able to illuminate a lot of the angles that we haven't even thought about in having these discussions. But you see, thank you wouldn't be sufficient if we haven't also mentioned our audiences. Otherwise, we would have been talking to ourselves. We didn't have audiences on the line. So thank you for participating. Thank you for your questions as well that brought out further insights from our panel of experts. And I'm also say a big thank you to my colleagues at the conversation who have made this happen. You've seen my face, you've seen Kagure's face, but we're not just the only two here. There are other colleagues whose faces you haven't seen, but without whom we wouldn't be having this conversation. Sifo is right there in the background. There's, of course, Candice, who you might have all have had one interaction or the other with to be part of this conversation today. Thank you very much for making this happen. And as we call the conversation, this conversation doesn't end here. This continues on our YouTube platform, continues on our social media platform, and hopefully might also become a copy that we will publish on the Conversation Africa platform as well. So the conversation doesn't end at the end of this session. But thank you very much for joining us today. Appreciate your time.